Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton. We'll be talking about Joe Biden's most recent State of the Union address, where he talked about his second term agenda, his successes over the past 4 years, and what he plans to deliver for the country if given a second term in office. And we are so excited to be welcoming a wonderful guest today to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, David. I'm Nate Lubin. Worked in politics for a long time. Worked for Barack Obama for almost 8 years in both of his campaigns in the Digital Strategy Office at the White House. I've worked in media and technology in the years since then in a bunch of different ways.
Awesome. So let's get into this. Joe Biden started the speech a bit untraditionally. He talked about foreign policy and his stance on the war in Ukraine, saying we'll never walk away, and contrasting his message with Donald Trump's recent comments, almost supporting Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and threatening NATO allies in the region. But Biden made a quick pivot into more domestic issues, talking about the threats that Republicans across the board pose to American democracy after Donald Trump threatened American democracy with January 6th and all his reshaping of the court system and everything that he did in his first term in office. And then he talked about the threats that Republicans pose to women's rights, to abortion rights, and kind of related those two topics, the threats to democracy and the threats to women's rights. Nate, do you think that Joe Biden did that effectively? And do you think that he's going to be able to relate those two messages as effectively as he did in the lead up to the 2022 midterms when Democrats succeeded in preventing a red wave?
Well, I think he had a very good night. I think the expectations for him were so low that he would have had to trip and fall down to not meet the standards. But then he, clearly came out very fired up and very ready to go. And that's sort of the most important thing, is that anyone watching that, would have recognized that he was physically up to it, whether they agree with what he was saying or not. And I think that was a deliberate choice to start with topics that you mentioned, because it was not a normal speech. It was a speech that was taking the fight to opponents quickly and frequently. So to your question about the connection between abortion and democracy, I mean, I think that is quite apparently true. There's a strong majority of the country which is demonstrated over and over again, when there's ballot issues, when there's elections, when there's any opportunity to vote, that does not agree with Republicans on abortion and rights. And so the opponents are forced into anti-democratic methods to try to achieve that, with the courts, with obstruction, with in some cases threats of violence, with all kinds of stuff. And so if you're going to do that, it means you're threatening democracy. Democracy has obviously been under attack for other reasons as well since 2020 and before that. And so connecting those two issues makes a lot of sense, and is substantively I think where a lot of us are feeling that we need to defend institutions, we need to make sure people are held to account for breaking the law, but by the same token, we need to let actual voters speak and let voters have their opportunity.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think that one of the Biden's strongest moments during the speech was when he welcomed Kate Cox, a woman who was denied abortion access in the state of Texas, into the hall. And he talked about her experience to the nation and connected that to recent Republican attacks on things like IVF treatment, which is incredibly popular across the board. You see Republicans across the country scrambling to kind of pick up after the state of Alabama, which had the Supreme Court there ban IVF. Do you think that Biden's calling out of judges on the Supreme Court and also judges in lower courts, like in Alabama, was appropriate? I know there were a bunch of Republicans that kind of jumped on that as a bit of a over partisan attack.
I mean, I think it's hard to decouple that from the tenor of the way these speeches have been shifting over the last number of years, right? If you'd asked me that question when I was in government 10 years ago, I think I would have said it was inappropriate and I don't think there's any scenario where Barack Obama would have done that when he was president. And maybe some of you remember there was even some versions of some of the early stuff. There was someone shouted "You lie," which caused a huge stir at the time. That was controversial. And this year, you see, Marjorie Taylor Greene showing up with a MAGA hat on the floor of the House, which is, violation of rules. And it barely was even a story this time. It was sort of a sideshow. So I think Joe Biden, President Biden, like, does not want to do this. I mean, I don't know that personally, but it seems quite apparent that that's probably where his preferred state of the world is. But if this is the terms of the engagement, he's got sort of no choice but to fight fire with fire a bit here and come out and make the case that he needs to. So yeah, would it be my preference that he was taking on the Supreme Court from that speech? No, but it also wouldn't be my preference that the Supreme Court would be doing many of the things that it's been doing. And certainly some of the more recent appointments have been quite political in their judgments, have had much less deference to precedent, much less deference to the will of people. And there's a role for that. There's a role for Supreme Court to protect rights traditionally and sort of be a counterweight. So it's not like they can't do that, obviously. But the more political these questions get, the more the president's going to have to stand up and actually say that.
Mhm. Yeah, Biden also used the speech to talk about his accomplishments over the past 4 years. He championed a strong economic recovery from the COVID pandemic. Certainly, America has made one of the strongest recoveries in the world, if not the strongest, despite Republican attacks that Biden hasn't done enough to support business. He championed the accomplishments of regaining auto jobs in the United States, using the town of Belvidere, Illinois, as an example of how of a town where the UAW and the Biden administration worked together to preserve the auto industry there. And he used this opportunity to contrast his record on bringing auto jobs back to the United States and keeping auto plants active in the U.S. with the fact that Donald Trump, over his time in office, had a record amount of jobs in the auto industry lost, despite his promises that he made in the 2016 campaign to union members. Biden welcomed the president of the UAW, Sean Fain, to the chamber, and this is right after Sean Fain endorsed Joe Biden. And his support is certainly something that Biden welcomes, especially in the state, in the critical state of Michigan, where auto union workers play a key role in turning the state either blue or red. And in recent years, there has been some erosion of Democrat support with union workers. And Biden is hoping that connecting his message to the UAW as much as possible is going to help reverse those trends, as he hopes. I think that one of the changes that we saw during the speech when Biden was talking about his economic agenda was he specifically talked about his own experience growing up in Scranton, Pennsylvania, as a relatively poor or middle class child, saying that Reaganomics did not put much on my dad's kitchen table. I thought that was a particularly powerful line. Do you think that this economic message and connecting the struggles that union families and families in these critical swing states face to Biden's accomplishments, do you think that that is breaking through to people?
I mean, I think, this is not a new observation, but presidents get too much credit when things are going well and too much blame when things are going badly in the economy. And I think you definitely feel that here. It's sort of the unusual case where, policies really have had an outsized effect in a recovery, right? And you referenced earlier the comparisons to other countries where the U.S. really is ahead of the game here, largely owing to the fact that there was a very significant stimulus, some would argue too large stimulus, but that was effective at keeping unemployment low and getting the economy going, and growth is higher than it is in most other places. I think, not everyone believes that, for sure. There's real challenges that people are having. And this is one of the, it's like my own work, other places where, how do you say two things that seem contradictory or not, right? One is that it really is better than the counterfactual and what would be in other countries. That's really true, right? The so-called misery index, the kind of combination of growth and inflation is like unemployment and inflation is at like an all-time low. And at the same time, there are millions of people who are really struggling and don't feel that. And inflation, while nominally low now, has been high, and so people are struggling with some of those price changes. And that's sort of the main challenge implicitly in a lot of the campaign for the next 8 months is going to be, how can that case be made well, and how can that intersect with some of the democracy questions you were asking about earlier. So I think he tried to do that, and he will, I'm sure, keep doing that for the next 8 months.
Yeah, definitely. One of the places that I thought Biden got really animated was when he was talking about immigration and the border. And this was partially due to, as you said earlier, Marjorie Taylor Greene's just completely crazy and inappropriate outfit and behavior. She actually gave Joe Biden a button during the speech with the name of a person who was killed by an undocumented immigrant. To which Biden, I think it was unplanned, made a response to that where he called out the name of Laken Riley, the person who was killed, and said that she was killed by an illegal. Do you think that this language is going to turn off some Democrats or progressives who may prefer that he use the term undocumented?
I mean, he got criticism for that after by some folks, and then he cleaned it up himself a bit afterward. Nancy Pelosi talked about it after. There's a bunch of commentary. I'm sure that was unplanned because he wouldn't have said it the way that he did. At least unplanned in the local sense of the specific words that were that response. I think it was planned to respond in some way like this. That was really part of the strategy. Um, I don't think that will have a big effect, good or bad, over time, right? That's sort of one of these local news stories around the speech. But he made a comment that was off the cuff that was mostly in support of the actual substance people wanted, using the wrong language, and that'll be what it is.
Yeah. So talking about more of the actual substance of Biden's agenda on border security, he has made a pivot in recent months to supporting more strict measures to secure the border. He supported a bipartisan compromise on a border security bill proposed by a senator from Oklahoma who is a very conservative senator. But it didn't pass, and the senator got a large amount of backlash from his conservative colleagues for even working with Democrats at all on border security. As much as Republicans talk about this issue, as soon as Donald Trump came out against the bipartisan border security compromise, Republicans killed it. And it's people like Marjorie Taylor Greene who are talking about immigration, talking about this as a fundamental national security threat, and then refusing to take action um, to support the cause that they supposedly care about. Do you think that this is the end of the road for border security measures or any sort of compromise on this issue before the election?
Well, it seems unlikely that it'll happen before the election. I mean, there's a history, depending on what happens in the election, where there could be something in a lame duck or there could be something afterward. I mean, this is not going to be ignored forever. But I think it's interesting. I mean, even since the speech, there's been some polling and some research about sort of what perceptions of who to blame for this issue are. There was an Axios story, I think, just this morning or yesterday about this, and swing voters are, I think, accurately blaming President Trump and Republicans for going back on their word here in a way that definitely was not true, 2 months ago. So those kinds of things have a tendency to force people to reconsider a little bit if that actually keeps playing forward. And I think some version of it will, because the substance here is so skewed, right? There was, as you pointed out, a very, very, very conservative set of representatives and senators who were behind this, compromise that was very conservative. It's basically the exact policy that they wanted, that Democrats have not supported for years and years. And then even that is deemed, unreasonable because Donald Trump thinks it's politically bad for him. That's so obviously true that there's going to be some backlash for that. But if your question is, will something pass? I'm not terribly optimistic that this Congress will pass much of anything, especially in the next couple of months.
Yeah, me neither. I know you worked in the Obama administration, and they tried to pass a border security and immigration reform bill. And previously, when Democrats would sit down at the table and negotiate with Republicans on this issue, there was always something that would be given to Democrats um, as sort of a compromise for their support for this bill. In this bill, in the most recent proposal, there was none of that. There was no pathway to citizenship for Dreamers. It was simply a security measure that would, yes, it would shrink asylum wait times from roughly 2 years now to 6 months, which would speed up the processing of everyone at the border. But it would significantly speed up the construction of the border wall, something that Donald Trump supports and is currently campaigning on. It would actually allow states that have technology to track fentanyl and human trafficking at the border. It would allow them to implement that, which is something that Donald Trump and Republicans supposedly support. But right now, the issue is too partisan to see any results, like you said. It's just, I'm sure it's as frustrating as it is for us for President Biden. And also
It's
James
almost like
Lankford
it's
on
not a good
the
faith
Republican side.
argument that they're making.
Yeah. So another part of the speech where I feel like Biden was trying to be the most measured, and you could hear it in his voice. It was most quiet around this part of the speech where he talked about the war in Gaza. He started out by expressing his empathy for the families who lost loved ones in the attack on Israel on October 7th, and expressed his staunch commitment to making sure that the hostages who are currently being held by Hamas unlawfully are returned to Israel alive, which I thought was something that, absolutely they should be pushing for. He did say the word ceasefire, I heard for the first time during this speech. He called for a 6-week pause in fighting, a 6-week ceasefire that is currently supported by Israel in negotiations, but Hamas has not agreed to that because they would like a longer ceasefire with more of a guarantee of a permanent end to fighting afterwards. I think that the Biden administration has to push Israel harder on this. They have to they have to fight to make sure that Israel guarantees a longer ceasefire, a longer pause in fighting, if Biden has any chance in winning back some of the support from young people and people of color that he's lost on this issue. Do you think that Biden's discussion of this war during the State of the Union, do you think he won any people back on this issue?
So I don't think that was his goal. I think his goal was to actually express what his position is. I think this is the kind of issue where the president has very long-standing beliefs and very long-standing commitments, and it's diplomacy, right? So what you hear people saying publicly is not always what they're advocating behind the scenes. It might be more likely to get the outcome that you want by moderating a little bit in some ways what the public stance is. And I think that very likely, you've heard this stuff from Anthony Blinken and others that, he was a bit more forthcoming publicly on this than he has been about the need to reduce violence quicker. But I don't think that's a new position. Like you noted maybe some of the changes in language. I think the bigger point is Chuck Schumer, I was recording this yesterday, going out on the floor and publicly taking a stand here as the highest ranking Jewish American elected official and publicly kind of repudiating the Netanyahu administration, and I think that signals a much more substantial sort of shift here, right? If the American Congress is not going to tolerate some of these things, particularly over time, that will have a quite direct effect potentially on some of the perceptions. I think that's more the lens that the president was thinking about this as well, was how do they actually get the substantive outcome they're trying to do? And folks can argue whether that was effective or not, but I really think that's what he was thinking about.
Yeah, I think one of the changes that they did announce in policy right before the State of the Union was the construction of a pier in Gaza by the military. Biden made clear that he's not putting American boots on the ground in Gaza, but he is instructing the military to construct this humanitarian pier to make sure that aid is able to get into Gaza more easily over the next few months. But I mean, I've heard from a lot of young people that this is not what they're expecting from the Biden administration. They're expecting so much more in terms of moves towards an end of this war. Um, so I mean, I think they could have done a lot better. But obviously, yeah, Biden is from a different generation. He cares deeply about Israeli security, and I think that yeah, that stance is incredibly popular among the American people. And what we've seen so far is that although there is a sizable uncommitted vote in some of the key states like Minnesota and Michigan, it hasn't been quite as significant as maybe some progressives were making it out to be. And we saw that in the most recent election in Congress, um, a Democrat who was a very staunch supporter of Israel won. Tom Suozzi won in his New York special election, despite being a strong supporter of Israel. So
Yeah, it's the adjacent congressional district to where I am right now. I mean, I think as I said before, it's the kind of thing where I think people are punished if it's perceived as a political decision. I think if, as I believe is the case, this is a substantive disagreement based on genuine belief that the president has about the best course of action to actually get the best outcome. Hopefully people will understand that over time. Um, I think that the notion though that the president and the administration is not trying to reduce violence as quickly and expeditiously as possible is just not true, right? There, as I said, Secretary Blinken I think has been there 8 times, and they're trying to actively engage as much as they possibly can to improve on this. And some of the things that activists have been arguing for, we can disagree on whether that's the best course of action. I'm not personally taking a position on that. I don't feel like I know well enough, but um, they are very actively trying to do this. And the pier is, the most maybe public version of that to start with, but they were airdropping supplies before. They have intervened in a bunch of different places, militarily and otherwise, to try to do what they can. And should they do more? Yeah, absolutely, they need to do more.
yeah. Also, in terms of messaging for young people, Biden celebrated his accomplishments over the past 4 years with delivering student loan forgiveness for 4 million American borrowers who, under a Republican administration, would never have gotten that forgiveness, despite the Supreme Court overturning Biden's original plan. Um, I think that the decision definitely muddied the waters for a lot of young people where they think that where they saw that that Biden's plan was overturned and they thought that Biden was not delivering on his promise, which I don't know how to get around exactly when it's just not Biden's fault that his stuff is being overturned in the courts. But it's going to be something that they have to message over the next few months, and I think Biden aggressively calling out Supreme Court justices. I mean, sort of aggressively calling out Supreme Court justices at the State of the Union and making some news on that topic is certainly a first step in making clear to young people that Biden is standing with them. Biden also championed the start of the Civilian Climate Corps, um, kind of in the frame of FDR's Civilian Conservation Corps that will that will give young people jobs to support our nation's fight against climate change. And he also passed the Safer Communities Act, the first bipartisan compromise on gun control in over 30 years, which was a major step in the right direction. It was not an assault rifles ban that he was calling for. It did not do a lot of the things that Biden has on his plans for attempting to solve the crisis of gun violence in our country, but it was a step in the right direction. And he welcomed the Uvalde families into the chamber um, to hear what he had to say on this topic. And I think it's so important that he did this with the Uvalde families. I think so many people have kind of moved on from that crisis. Um, and from their stories. And I think Biden showed in the State of the Union that he's not willing to do that. He's not going to forget these people who lost their loved ones, um, largely due to the fact that we have Republicans in our country who are not willing to solve the problem of gun violence that is killing a large amount of young people.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that it was a strong part of the speech, and this is an issue, gun violence prevention, that the president has a very long history with, dating back to when he was a senator, and assault weapons ban and related measures. Yeah, I mean, this is an illustration of the importance of participating, right? I mean, um, residents really can't do very much on this kind of a topic absent of new legislation, right? And that requires Congress, and the Republicans in Congress are uh, completely refusing. Almost always, this was an exception that you referenced, this law that passed, relatively um, small in stature, but important in principle, in terms of, as you said, starting to actually pass something to make the problem a little bit better. But there's a long way to go, right? Closing gun show loopholes, closing background check loopholes, closing a lot of these other restrictions so that, folks who have committed crimes and are demonstrably threats in the community, that they don't have access to firearms, like things that get, overwhelming support, bipartisan support. Um, if they were actually put up for votes, they very often would pass, but they don't get put up for votes um, by Republicans in Congress, because they're beholden to these, very small groups of their primary electorates that are unbelievably extreme in their views. And the best remedy for that is to win elections, so that they don't have the gavel to decide what's getting put up for a vote.
Yeah. And I would think that in order for Congress to do a bit more on this topic, they would have to abolish the filibuster, which requires Democrats to win the Senate in this next election, which is a tall order, and it's going to require people across a lot of swing states um, to vote for Democrats, despite maybe disapproving of him in some cases. But I think one of the reasons why Joe Biden has been underwater in recent polls has been the fact that he is an older candidate and he looks older. And going into this speech, a lot of people were expecting Joe Biden to maybe stumble over a few more sentences, to not be able to effectively get out his message. And I think that those people were wrong. He was certainly able to deliver his message in a convincing way. And he talked about his age in a way that I had never heard him talk of it before. He said that, this is a battle for the soul of our nation, and his age is a testament to his experience of seeing this battle play out over generations. Do you think that Joe Biden, conducted himself effectively in this speech and gave off and warded off some of the fears that he is maybe too old to be an effective president over the next 4 years?
Yeah, I think we started the conversation there that was the most important attribute of the whole speech, was that he kind of had this energy and aggressiveness and dedication to making the strongest case. And I do think that came through. Is he the same speaker he was 20 years ago, 30 years ago? No, but he's also got 20 years more experience and has demonstrated an ability to lead that is quite impressive. And so I think that was the main takeaway was, this is not a shrinking violet who's afraid to the moment or needs to be, coddled to make the speech. Just the opposite, right? He was taking the fight to political opponents. He was in real time responding and ad-libbing responses. He was, staying long afterward and talking to folks. And I remember there's conversations I had with friends of mine and others, and an email list and others, where it's like, we're all sitting here watching on TV and exhausted at 11 o'clock at night or whatever, and this guy is, making this case and publicly, making this full-throated advocacy that needs to happen. And so that's not the last time this is going to come up, obviously, right? This is going to be an issue every day for the rest of this cycle, but it's not like the other guy is some young up and comer, right? He's almost as old, and in many cases actually had just as many, if not more, mental lapses in public, maybe more damning ones in public, and somehow that doesn't get talked about, right? It's people want to ascribe these problems to Joe Biden, who has like been doing the job incredibly well and incredibly consistently, and by all accounts behind the scenes is active, whereas the other guy gets Nancy Pelosi and his political opponent confused on the stump. So there's many different examples of this. So I was personally very happy to see that dynamic play out in real time in front of so many people.
Yeah, I think to what you were saying, a lot of people when they hear Trump mess up, they just think, oh, well, he's an untraditional politician. He's in some cases he's stupid. And they kind of, in saying that, forgive some of his lapses in speech because of his old age. And since people think that Biden was at one point an effective politician, they think that he is, when he messes up, that his mental acuity is degrading. But I agree, he did very effectively in this speech, and yeah, he stayed long after and certainly engaged with a lot of people and showed that he had the energy to continue this campaign and his job. I think that it's to be seen how well he's able to carry himself like actually on the trail. I know he had a long time to prepare this speech and to practice every line to make sure that he was able to give it as effectively as he did. I hope that they develop a campaign speech that is consistent as much as possible so that Biden can give it effectively every single time. But that's to be seen. Since I'm from Massachusetts, I have to recognize one thing that he said about the age of his ideas being what people should judge him on instead of his chronological age. That is a line that I've heard a lot from Ed Markey, our older senator here in Massachusetts, and he has had incredible success in the past few elections, appealing to young people, appealing to progressives, saying that he may not be the youngest person in the primary or in the general, but he is someone who is effectively able to do his job and is effectively able to represent the opinions of young people. And that's what ultimately our generation really cares about, that we have a politician that's going to reflect our views on issues like abortion rights, on climate change, on gun violence, on supporting our economic recovery. And if Biden can make that case to young people over the next few months, and hopefully, he's working around the clock. I know he is, to resolve this conflict in the Middle East. I think that he has a very good chance at repairing some of the challenges that he faces right now on the campaign trail. Just in closing, anything that you would like to tell our audience about maybe what you noticed in your experience working in the White House about how a State of the Union is prepared and what it's like when it's executed effectively?
Well, every president is different. In our era, the speech was started months in advance, and actual drafting would be weeks in advance, and the president was personally very involved with it. My office, we weren't writing the speech obviously, but we were quite involved with the preparation around sort of understanding it and making the case for it and building assets and videos and graphics, oftentimes releasing some of the policy in advance. I think President Biden has had a bit of a more traditional view of how to do the State of the Union. It's sort of an update on the state of the world. There's some policy announcements that he was more focused on sort of documenting and recounting what had happened from my conversations with some folks who are in the current administration. I think this is quite common, right? You're working up to the last minute and updating and changing specifics and figuring it out. The folks who show up in the First Lady's box are often, as you pointed out in our conversation, they're reflective of policy topics and issues that are happening. So that's a negotiation and a conversation happening right up until the end. So I mean, the final words are very well considered, but oftentimes as you saw in this speech, right, the president made changes on the fly, and it's at the end of the day, it's his speech, right? It's his reflection of what he thinks is important for people to understand. Um, and you felt that. I think the speech is not the end, right? It's often kicking off a public campaign for what he thinks is important, for what he thinks needs to be done, and he's made already a number of both official and also campaign travel afterward. I'm sure more is coming. Um, but yeah, it's a different trajectory going forward, and the folks in the building are going to be thinking about how best to distill very complicated big ideas and substantive policies into more digestible bites that maybe are a bit easier to explain.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Nate, for joining our podcast today. And thank you, everyone, for listening. This has been Pod Save the Youth. I'm your host, David Seaton.
And I'm Nate Lubin.
Join us next time on Pod Save the Youth.